Are you nervous about your upcoming residency interviews? It can be really tough to sell yourself.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's MedEdits YouTube office hours. I haven't seen everybody in a couple of weeks, so I'm really happy to be here. It's really hilarious that there's an ad for residency interviews before we stream, which is sort of ironic because that's what we specialize in. So I wonder how that happens. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my YouTube so I can see both your questions as well as all the questions that people have sent in. And we got a lot of questions that were sent in ahead of time, so that's really terrific. And I encourage everyone to send their questions in advance. So that we can, try to get to as many of these as possible. And what I really try to do is I try to answer questions that will that apply to as many people as possible. Because obviously some questions are very sort of student specific and personal and case specific, and so I try to address those topics that will, be a concern of as many people out there as we can. It continues to be a very interesting admission season, both for medical school and for residency as well. There have been, not so many developments, but certainly, everyone is still trying to navigate this and figure out what's going on and what's going to be happening with deadlines and things. Most medical schools have extended deadlines or are starting to extend deadlines, which is what we expected to happen, so that they will be extending interviews later and everything is sort of pushed later in the year. And I expect that will continue to happen. And residency situations are continuing to evolve as the, residency programs are all switching to virtual interviews. And, that kind of makes things a little bit complex with regards to residency interview season, since it means that students will be able to go on more interviews. It will also be interesting to see if residency programs actually extend more interviews, because by not having to have faculty, be present for an interview day in the same way, residency programs will have the capacity to actually interview more people, since, they will most probably be recording things like tours of the hospital and introductions to the program, so that those things won't have to be done live. So, it really kind of opens things up for residency programs. And, having talked to some program directors out there, nobody really knows exactly how they're approaching this yet. So it's all kind of to be determined. So some of the questions that everybody is going to have, there really aren't answers to yet. So the buzzword for this application season for everybody, whether you're applying to med school, whether you're applying to residency, whether you're getting ready to apply to med school in 2021, and we've started getting some questions actually from that cohort of applicants right now. Things are very much up in the air, but something that is really important to keep in mind as you're going through this process is that everybody is trying to be as flexible and as open-minded as possible, and they're trying to make this as easy for applicants as they can. So just kind of, keep that in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and start answering some of the questions that were sent to us in advance. Somebody asked something about the MedMar service, which is for underrepresented minorities. And this is a great question. I realize this doesn't apply to everybody out there, but I think it's important. And they've received emails from some schools where the GPA and the MCAT are above what their MCAT and GPA are. And they're wondering if they should be adding those schools to their medical school list. Now, whatever cohort you are in, whether you are Caucasian, whether you are an underrepresented minority, whether you are Asian, whatever that may be, you want to look at the AAMC data that is aligned with your cohort, okay? And that's really important. So for underrepresented minorities, and this is just a fact, it's how it is, the overall and average MCAT and GPA for that cohort of applicants is lower. So if a school is sort of sending you recruitment emails and recruitment notices, and that's how I interpret this, these are recruitment notices. By all means, you should be responding to those and you should be adding them to your list. So that's really important. I also got a great list of questions from an MD PhD applicant. And they were asking, about a gap year for MD PhD, explaining that they want to get more research, and should they be getting a letter from the PI and put that experience in the application if they want to submit the application as soon as possible. And because of COVID, assuming that you are applying this year, you are able to put down experiences that will be happening. We have always encouraged our students to put down experiences that are starting on the submission date or later, even if they haven't delved into those experiences yet, because it's important to let admissions committees know what you have on the agenda. This is also why update letters are really important, in this process, right? You always want to be sort of letting everyone know what you have going on. So when you submit your application, it's not as if things end. This is a very fluid process, and you want to be continuing to improve your candidacy throughout the year. How do extracurricular activities differ for MD versus MD PhD? They don't really differ, but MD PhD students all have very extensive research. So I did a video on extracurricular experiences for pre-medical students, right? And I talked about, students have a spike in a certain area and maybe have, upwards of 500 to 1,000 or more hours in a specific activity or discipline. And so for MD PhD students, that spike, if they only have one spike, is in research, right? If they may also have two spikes, honestly. So there are some exceptional applicants who might have two spikes, but certainly anyone who's applying to an MD PhD program needs to have exceptional research. And our students who have been successful getting into MD PhD programs have had really great research experiences, and that have been very long-standing. Now, how does the application process differ, and how do you increase your chances of getting accepted if you are an MD PhD? MD PhD students complete two additional essays on the AMCAS application. One is why MD PhD, and the other is writing about your significant research experiences. And then when you are actually going through the application process, you are applying to both the MD and the PhD divisions of that school. So you have more interviews. There are obviously two divisions that need to accept you. There are some schools that might say, okay, you're not competitive for the PhD, so we're going to shift you to the MD only track, right? So MD PhD is definitely more competitive. Sometimes we'll have students who say, oh, I'm going to apply to MD PhD because that's going to be an easier way to get in. It's not an easier way to get in. This is not a good strategy. In terms of how the interview is different, the MD interview alone is not going to be different. They may ask you specifically, why are you applying to MD PhD? But obviously when you have your PhD interview, you are going to most likely be paired up with somebody who shares your research interests, and they're really going to want to know a lot about your interest in research and what you sort of anticipate in terms of a future career. And this person also suggested that we make a video about MD PhD programs. I think that's a super idea, and we are going to get on that once things sort of slow down a bit. We're still in our super busy season here, and we're actually hearing from some applicants, that they're still considering applying this year. So it really is, there's no question, a very drawn out admission season this year, which is understandable. And something else that I'm sure will address many of the questions that are in the chat right now is that this is one year when you can apply late. MCAT scores are going to be accepted very late, even through September, most medical schools are saying. And so if there's one year where you can submit a late application and not have it be incredibly detrimental, this is the year. Okay. In past years, we would tell people who were calling us around this time, it would depend on their candidacy, but we might advise some students to wait until next year. Now we're advising most people, assuming that they're competitive applicants, we're saying, go ahead and apply this year. It's not too late, assuming that you are competitive, to get into medical school in the first place. So someone who is a career changer and both parents are physicians, and they've heard that med schools look down upon people whose parents are doctors. This is not true. We are all influenced by the people in our lives. We're influenced by our parents. We're influenced by any important role models whom we may have growing up, as well as throughout our educations. Many parents many students of parents who are doctors go into medicine. This is not looked down upon at all. So in fact, it really inspires interest, and it might show actually they're really committed right after seeing a parent and seeing how hard they work and everything they do. You're still interested in medicine actually says a lot. So this is something that we encourage people to write about, those influences, whatever those influences may be, right? So one influence isn't better or worse than the other. And this is all about kind of coming out and explaining your story and explaining your path and kind of what led you to medical school. That's what's most important. Someone who is a pre-med student trying to get research is having a very difficult time getting research and is now wondering if they should be looking into research positions in psychology, sociology. Any research is great, right? So if you do research, you're doing literature searches, you're analyzing data, you're doing literature reviews, you're learning how to think critically. So these skills, whether you're doing some sort of, basic science, biological research, or psychology, sociology research, is the same. So everyone kind of understands, everyone does understand that this year is different, that, many students who had planned on doing research in a lab, they're not able to do that. So if you're able to get an experience in psychology or sociology, and you also have a demonstrated interest in those disciplines as well, that's completely respectable and something that I would certainly encourage. I would also like your opinion on doing a gap year of my senior year. And to do more volunteering community service work. Is it true that 70% of the current cycle medical school matriculants have done gap years? I don't know if it's as high as 70%, but yes, the majority of students are now taking at least one gap year. So that means they are at least applying at the end of their senior year and taking a gap year during the application year. Okay, now there are really a couple reasons why students are doing this. Number one, it's really hard to get all your prerequisites in, study for your MCAT, get all your experiences in basically 3 years if you apply at the end of junior year. It simply is impossible for a lot of people. So it's a practical decision for many students. Okay, number two is, if you're not taking a gap year, you are being interviewed alongside students who have taken gap years. And certainly when it comes down to interviewing, the students who have taken gap years often present themselves as being more mature and more sophisticated than students who have not taken gap years. So in our experience, students who take gap years tend to have an easier time in the admissions process. So I think there are a lot of reasons why this is all coming into play. And there are some schools, medical schools, that are very direct about the fact that they want students to have real world experience. And that really varies from medical school to medical school. So definitely the trend right now is certainly moving towards taking at least one gap year. However, we do work with students who apply at the end of junior year. They're super duper awesome students academically. They're really motivated, and they have managed to get everything done beautifully. So, it's not as if you can't apply at the end of junior year and be successful. You can, but certainly the trend is towards not doing that, I would say. Okay, someone who has a 2.83 GPA and is currently doing AmeriCorps and wanted to apply to master's and post-bac programs that did not meet criteria. I wanted to get an MPH, but was advised no, because that will not help my science GPA. And this is completely true. So when you are looking to do academic enhancement, meaning that you're looking to improve your GPA, you want to enroll in courses or a program that is going to allow you to bump the BCPM, biochem, physics, math GPA. Okay, enrolling in something where you're just going to bump your all other GPA is not really going to help you. Medical schools obviously are concerned about your overall GPA, but they're most concerned about the science classes and the level of rigor in those classes. So we definitely advise students who have a lowish GPA, who are trying to make themselves more competitive to medical school, to either enroll in classes, in science classes, or to enroll in programs that primarily have BCPM classes. And certainly MPHs, a lot of them do not have a lot of BCPM classes. I took my MCAT on June 19th. I received a low score. I rescheduled for September 3. My questions are, would mid-September be too late to submit applications? Is it best to wait until next year and apply again, and no wanting to rush? Okay, so there are a few things here. If you take an MCAT in June, July, August, that gives you 3 months, basically, a little less than 3 months, or maybe even less, right? If you started studying and sort of reconsidering retaking the MCAT once you received your score, which probably came in late June sometime. And so for the vast majority of students, 2 months is not enough time to regroup and to figure out what they could do better and how they can really bump their score significantly. Now, we will talk to students who say, you know what, on June 19th, there was a problem with the testing center. Someone came in the middle of the test and told them they weren't be compliant with COVID, and, and they shut down for a little while. And so we had to pause. And, so if there's a defined reason why maybe you didn't do so well, then you can turn right back around potentially and retake that test and do well. But if usually 2 months is not going to be enough time to figure out what you need to do to really bump the score significantly. Now, if you're in the camp of there was something that went wrong and I know I can do better on a retest, then we would encourage you to submit your application now. Don't wait until September. Submit your application now and then take the test in September, and your application will obviously be complete once those scores are in. Now, again, this is in the year of COVID, we're recommending this. We would never, ever recommend a September MCAT under normal circumstances, okay? Is it best to wait until next year to apply? I don't want to rush. Now, if you really need to figure out what you need to do to bump that MCAT score, then yes, certainly we would recommend just waiting until next year then, because, depending on how low the MCAT is, you might not be competitive, for admission this year. Okay, so how important is it? Juan asks, how important is it to submit secondaries within 2 to 3 weeks? Are applications reviewed in the order they are received, or are they filtered in some way? This is a great question, Juan. So the vast majority of medical schools are going to send you secondary applications and secondary essays, prompts automatically, okay? So those schools have not screened you, the vast majority of them. So it is possible that, because most schools do have screenings of some sort, they have minimum cutoffs. These are not all publicly available. So the vast majority of schools are going to screen. So it's possible that, even if you get that secondary submitted within 2 weeks of receiving it, that you're going to get screened out if you don't meet their cutoffs, okay? It is impossible, in our opinion, depending on how many schools you're applying to turn around all of your secondaries in 2 to 3 weeks. Generally, schools will review applications in the order in which they are completed, Again, this year's a little bit different because most medical schools are going to be reviewing applications even if they don't have MCAT scores, depending. So this is a very strange year. Ideally, our goal is to have our students complete all of their secondary essays, again, depending on how many schools they're applying to, by Labor Day, okay? Obviously, if you can get them all done by the end of July, that's fantastic. Many people don't, have that luxury. This year, I feel like more students do, though, because most students are not working and their opportunities have been canceled. So it's possible that students will be completing secondaries a little bit more efficiently this year. But, as we know, many people procrastinate, even if they do have that extra time. What can be done during pandemic in lieu of shadowing or scribing for doctors? It's very tough, Akshay. I know that there are some virtual shadowing opportunities out there. I've actually sort of tuned into some of them, and they're actually pretty fantastic in terms of what people are doing right now with regards to bringing, their, what is it called? The GoPros, like into the OR and stuff like that. So those opportunities do exist. Nothing really takes the place of true shadowing, and certainly nothing takes the place of true scribing. We do have people who work as scribes who are working now in a variety of geographic areas. So if you have a gap year, it's possible you could get a scribe position right now. Would I be correct in guessing there's not a lot of content dealing with plants or ecology on the MCAT? Yeah, I think that's a pretty good assumption to make. Is it bad if there's a small mistake in your MCAS coursework section of your application? It depends on what that is. So if you make a really big mistake in the coursework section of your application, then AMCAS is going to contact you because it might be difficult to verify the application. So your coursework, the way it's written, should match up with what is written on your transcript as closely as possible, because a human being actually sits there and matches everything up to make sure that everything sort of is well aligned. So you will hear from AMCAS if that small mistake is actually a big mistake from their perspective. Okay, hold on one sec. I'm scrolling too quickly here. Gosh, you guys asked a lot of questions. Okay, all right, this is all good. Do you think medical schools, Darcy asked, do you think medical schools will start reviewing applications later than average? Yes, absolutely, there's no question. We have some students who already have DO interviews, no MD interviews yet, but definitely schools, everything is delayed. And medical schools are also holding spots, right? So they're not extending as many interviews early because they're sort of holding spots for students that they know are coming later in the process and who are getting their MCATs back later in the process. Do you have any advice if we have low step scores? This is a question for residency. I feel we'll be at a disadvantage more than usual because they'll have to limit interviews somehow. This is such a tough question, and I've been talking to different people about this. It's possible, honestly, that residency programs might actually be having more interviews this year. And that's because instead of spending 8 hours, instead of sort of locking up your faculty for 8 hours for an interview day or 6 hours during an interview day, they're going to be able to be much more efficient in how they conduct their residency interview days, right? So traditionally, students come in, you meet the program director, you go on tours, and it's a pretty in-depth process, a residency interview day. But now all of that stuff is likely to be pre-recorded. The University of Arizona Internal Medicine actually has set a great precedent because they've been holding virtual interviews for several years now, and so a lot of residency programs are looking to them for how to do this. So I think there's going to be a lot of pre-recorded information that programs will have students look at before they come to the program. And then all they're going to do is actually have those faculty interviews. So I don't know what's going to happen yet with residency. It's going to be interesting. And like I said, having talked to program directors, there's no consensus yet in terms of how to navigate this. Some specialties are trying to limit the number of interviews that students will go on, but I think it's going to be difficult to police that, honestly. And then programs, I think once they sort of, kind of do the math and they realize that they can easily conduct more interviews than they usually do, I think that they may opt to have more interviews and actually, let's say a program typically traditionally interviews 100 applicants, they may decide to interview 150 applicants. So we're going to kind of have to wait and see what happens. Would applying in third week of August, since I get my MCAT score, then be late for this cycle because I want to see my score and then add schools to AMCAS? What I would advise you to do, Darcy, is to submit your application now so it gets verified, because that's the rate limiting step in getting verified is when you submit. So submit the application now. Once you see your MCAT score, then you can add schools on. And we do this all the time with our students. We kind of come up with a preliminary list. And then once we know where their MCAT is, then we, kind of finalize that school list. Okay, that's sort of a political question. I'm not going to go there. Okay. Okay, this is a great question Shivani asks. How common is it for first-year med students to shadow to figure out their specialty? Should I shadow as a first year to figure out what specialty I want? Shivani, that is a great question. This is something that I encourage all first years to do. So people think that once they're actually in medical school that their shadowing days are behind them, okay? Your shadowing days are behind you if you know what specialty you want to pursue, okay? The vast majority of first year, even second year medical students, even third year medical students have no clue what they want to pursue. Third year goes super fast, okay? And you generally, at most medical schools, especially the more traditional ones, you only get exposure to the major specialties in medicine. So the sooner that you can get exposure to all of the specialties in medicine the more informed you're going to be when making that specialty choice. Now, the other thing that I encourage people to do is not only to shadow a variety of specialists, but to shadow a variety of specialists in a variety of different settings. So, for example, the way that you, practice emergency medicine, and I can tell you this because I'm an emergency physician, I've practiced in multiple settings, the way you practice emergency medicine in an academic hospital versus a city hospital versus a community private hospital are completely different. And so you may actually, if you're shadowing in your academic hospital, right, which is the primary place most students are going to shadow, if you shadow an emergency physician in your academic hospital, you're just getting sort of one viewpoint of how that practice is, what sort of the norms are for that practice, versus how it's practiced in the community, which is completely different. So it's important to get as much exposure as you can. Okay, so Darshi asked, I tried to check the website of a couple of schools and I do not see that they've extended their deadlines and couldn't find a definitive answer. Not all schools have given these definitive answers yet. And it is tough to find this information. So if there is a specific school that you want to know what their deadline is, you should call them if it's not listed. You also should check the MSAR, the medical school admissions requirements. Schools should be updating that database with all of the new deadlines and things. Not all the schools are doing this. Some schools are better than others, right? And also deadlines are shifting. So just because there's, let's say, one deadline today, there might be a different deadline next week, depending on, where a school is geographically and what's going on in the country. Okay, Shirley asks, I had to push my MCAT test dates back to August 7th because I got sick right before my test. I know a lot of people are in the same boat, but how late is it to send secondary? So Shirley, if you're taking your MCAT August 7th, you can be working on your secondaries now, actually. So there's no reason that you can't. I mean, obviously you want your focus to be your MCAT, that should be your primary focus. But you could sort of get in for a few of your target schools that are really important to you. You could get those secondaries done now, and make sure that you've submitted. Don't wait for the MCAT to submit if you plan on applying this year. Do you have any thoughts on how the fact that step 1 is now pass-fail will affect residency chances? Does this mean that school reputation will matter more? School reputation, Sophie, always mattered with regards to getting residency. And why is that? It's because the people who are going to be guiding you are the people who are writing your letters. They're the people who have the connections that maybe you're going to want, okay? That said, it is still my feeling, even with step 1 going pass-fail, that if you are at a medical school in the United States, that you have the opportunity to pursue any specialty that you want. You just might have to work a little bit harder or a little bit differently to help to guarantee your match in that specialty. Okay, certainly now that step 1 is pass-fail, school reputation is going to matter, maybe a little bit more, but ultimately I still think that it's not going to shift things that much. I still think that, top students are top students. The top students from any school are still going to do well, and they're still going to get the specialty that they want. So always look at a school's match history, because ultimately it's the school's match history that's going to give you the best idea of how those students do in the residency match. And that is not going to change. That historical data will still be extremely important. You mentioned sending update letters. When would be a good time to send them after secondaries? Yeah, so Sung-Soo, you don't want to send update letters until you, first of all, have something to really say. So sometimes students think, oh, I'm just going to send an update letter just because then they'll think I'm interested, right? Don't bombard schools with too many update letters. So you want to update schools when you really have something to update them with. And, whenever you have that update, if it's significant enough, then you want to send an update letter. Our students, so I see this is a question someone else has. Our students generally will start to send update letters in the late fall or early winter at the earliest, okay? It's also good to kind of save your updates, right? So you wanna kind of give schools a little bit of a reason to take a look at you. So you wanna wait until you have decent updates. Okay, I'm just scanning these questions. Okay, so Pooja asks, for students who are not applying during the cycle, how do you suggest we gain clinical experience? It's really hard. You could actually, EMT work is something that I think is great this, this cycle, because we always will need EMTs, right? So I think if you can work as an EMT, I think that's actually a great way to get clinical experience. If you are not currently in school, there's clinical exposure and there's clinical experience. Undergraduates generally cannot get clinical experience, right? Just because they're still in school and they don't have the time to devote to work full time. Although we do have many of our students who work as EMTs as undergraduates, right? But if you are done with college and you can make a full time commitment, or even a part time commitment, see if you can, work as an EMT or maybe work as a scribe, things such as shadowing, I think those will be at a minimum depending on, where you live. And then of course there are, like I mentioned, there are some virtual opportunities. I don't know, honestly, if those are gonna really look so great on applications. That should not be, to me, that sort of is more of a way to kind of supplement your experiences, but not something that you wanna rely upon with regards to your candidacy. Do you have recommendations on how to write the YDO essay? This is a great question, Matthew. And you need to go to the DO website. And I don't know exactly what it is off the top of my head. We can post that later. But you want to really understand, what does it mean to practice osteopathic medicine, and how does osteopathic medicine differentiate itself from allopathic medicine? Now, in the real world, having worked alongside MDs and DOs, there is usually no difference, honestly, in how MDs versus DOs practice. But DOs do, sort of the way that they are educated is to take a much more holistic approach to patient care and to evaluating patients. And they're very focused on preventive care. And then, of course, there's manipulative therapy, which many DOs don't actually use once they've finished medical school. But you should understand sort of the ideals and the guiding principles of osteopathic medicine, and all of that you can find on the primary osteopathic website. When is a good time to submit secondaries this year? So as I scroll and it goes all the way down to the bottom. I would say still submit your secondaries as early as you can. Like I said, med schools thus far have not started extending interviews. We have seen that some schools have officially said they won't be extending any interviews until August. That's sort of pretty typical anyway. The earliest that our students ever get MD interviews is the end of July. We do have students who are getting osteopathic interviews, however. So I would still say that you don't want to drag your feet on the secondaries, assuming your application is complete and you have the time to complete those secondaries, you want to get them done. You want to get them done as quickly as you can. Lauren asks, will medical schools look down on short-term activities that were cut short because of external factors, COVID, program cost, and how do you show this in your application? When you write about an activity, you can explain that it was cut short due to COVID. Most schools are actually, they have a secondary about COVID. Many schools have added this to their secondary essay prompts. Can you, explain how COVID impacted you? And certainly that would be a place to also write about that. And they won't look down upon you. With all of this, you have to realize everybody's in the same boat. Everyone had stuff that was cut short. Everyone's, if they were in school, they went to, virtual remote learning. So just kind of keep in mind that all applicants this year are going through the same thing and have the same sort of insecurities. And the medical schools, when they're looking at applications, it's going to be apples to apples with regards to activities that students weren't able to pursue because of COVID. Oh, this is interesting. So Lauren writes, I was invited by the physician to work on clinical research experience, but I'm afraid this may appear negative. It won't appear negative. So she thinks that somehow will be perceived as being negative because of COVID. you know, this is about being careful, right? Physicians don't stop working because of COVID. You know, this is where PPE comes into play. So as long as you're super careful, as long as you know, use your PPE, you follow all the hospitals, you know, guidelines and rules, I actually think that could be a fantastic experience and something that you could then discuss, you know, in terms of, you know, understanding how difficult it is to practice medicine right now because of all these different rules and regulations that, depending on where you are, change literally daily. You know, if you're in a hot spot, I know that's, you know, that's sort of how it goes. Is it better to have most of your extracurriculars focused on medicine, or would it be better to have a breadth of interest? This is a great question, Amy. And, you know, again, I encourage everyone to watch my extracurricular video. So you certainly want your most important experiences, at least a couple of them, to be focused on medicine or research or public health or community service, right? So you can't, you know, say to somebody that you want to be a doctor if you have no experience in medicine and in science. You know, but that said, many students, especially high achieving students, will be very accomplished in other disciplines and in other areas, right? So medical schools want interesting students. So if you can show that you're interesting, then then you certainly want to. It's not looked, you're not looked down upon if you have interest in other areas, certainly. Okay. Can we put high school shadowing experience on our medical school application? Generally speaking, we do not encourage students to include high school activities on the medical school application unless unless the experience was really, really exceptional. Oh, okay. Oh, this is for FlexMed. Okay. Okay, Pooja, you're applying to FlexMed. Okay, FlexMed is an accelerated program that students apply to at their sophomore year of college to gain early admission to Mount Sinai, the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. So assuming that you're talking about FlexMed, certainly you want to put that on your FlexMed application because you're only a sophomore. Your high school GPA matters, but what matters more are going to be your SAT, ACT scores, and your undergraduate GPA. You know, what the high school GPA that you got is going to, you know, kind of be reflected largely in terms of the college that you are attending, although certainly there's some students who attend public high schools and I mean public colleges for financial reasons, and you know, so that isn't always the case across the board, and we do work with FlexMed students who have gone to very prestigious undergraduate colleges and also some who go to public colleges, you know, for that exact reason. Should students become an EMT or volunteer in the emergency department to strengthen the admissions application? Yes, those are both great ways to strengthen your application and to get great clinical exposure without question. All right, I'm going to kind of start at the bottom, and we're going to, let me see. You guys are asking a lot of good questions today. Okay. Would admissions committees like if I mentioned that I already know my specialty and that I'm passionate about, or would they prefer me to be open to all specialties since I'm still an undergrad? Lara, this really depends on what your experiences are. So if you've had really important experiences that have sort of pointed you in a specific direction and you are pretty confident about what you know you want to pursue, that's terrific, right? So this is all about backing up your interest, right? You don't want to come out and say, I want to be a plastic surgeon, and you've had no exposure to plastic surgery. But if your experiences offer evidence for your interest in that specialty, by all means, it's fine if you have a sense of what you want to pursue when you start medical school. It's also fine if you have no clue, right? The vast majority of students don't really know. If I started a new volunteer position in June because COVID cut my other volunteer position, should I still put it on my activities? I think what you're asking, if you should put the new volunteer position that you started in June on there, yes. And assuming that the other volunteer position, you actually participated in it, at least a little bit, but then it was cut short, I think you could include that as well. It also depends on how many activities you have. Something that we will look at with students when they have too many activities is we will look at combining activities, or which activities look relatively insignificant compared to other activities. And that's how we kind of either decide to merge activities or to cut activities. Do you think submitting secondaries at the end of August or early September will still be risky even for this cycle? I would like it if students would submit secondaries by the end of August. That is not too late for any cycle, honestly. You know, so we want you submitting early. Taking MCAT into September is okay. Getting secondaries done as early as possible, not rushing your work so that you compromise the quality of those documents, and getting secondaries in the end of August, I think is fine, especially this year, because I think, you know, medical schools are all pushing back those deadlines, you know, in terms of when they're reviewing applications, when they're extending interviews. So I think that's a fine time. I think almost all schools have a dean's letter. This is for residency. So residencies send out sort of a composite letter when you're applying for residency at the end of, and you know, not the end, but you know, during your 4th year of medical school, and it sort of is a composite of all of your rotations and a summary of who you are. And generally speaking, they also then have a word at the end of the letter that kind of ranks you in your class and puts you into quartiles, or you know, something specific to that medical school. And so Shivani is asking, I think almost all schools have a dean's letter, or it's also called a medical school performance evaluation letter, or MSPE, which is sent to residency programs. Right, yes, that is correct. If so, is a student's rank on there usually? The rank is on there, but it's not a specific number. So it's usually a ranking, outstanding, excellent, good, fair, poor kind of thing that then corresponds to where you are in the medical school class. That information is something that your medical school will give you. They don't hide that information. Okay, you mentioned to look into match rate when applying to medical schools. For a school like UIW, School of Osteopathic Medicine, this is pretty new. Would you suggest not to apply? Sometimes going to a new medical school is actually offers great opportunities, right? Because you then have the, there's always the possibility that you can actually impact that medical school's curriculum, that you're the first class. So attending a new medical school is not always a bad idea. You want to look at the leadership. You want to see where the leadership has come from. You want to get a sense of, okay, they came from this medical school and they did X, Y, and Z at that medical school. So I can anticipate that that this medical school is going to be pretty fantastic. So for example, like when Hofstra opened, you know, there were some really outstanding Mount Sinai, former Mount Sinai physicians and leaders who went to Hofstra. And so it was easy to predict that that school was going to be fantastic, right? So you want to look at the leadership and you want to know what have they done and what have they achieved at their previous institution. Okay. All right, I'm just going to answer maybe a couple more questions here. I think most of these are repeating things that we've already talked about. Okay, do you have any tips for BSMD program applicants? For BSMD programs are programs that you apply to as a high school senior, and that will allow you to apply for both a medical school degree and an undergraduate degree. So when most students that we work with who are applying to BSMD programs are pretty exceptional students. So the biggest thing that they have to decide is, do I want to go to this stellar undergraduate institution, or do I want to go to a BSMD program? Because most BSMD programs are not affiliated with very prestigious undergraduate institutions. So BSMD students largely have to have the same things as medical school applicants. So if you were to watch my video about extracurricular activities for pre-meds, and we also have a BSMD video as well, but you want to make sure that you have clinical exposure. You want to make sure you have research of some sort. Obviously, you know, depending on where you are in this process, I mean, certainly high school this summer was kind of, you know, students were not able to do any research in high school, and most programs were canceled this summer. So hopefully next summer, everything will open up again, and you know, and it'll be very important for you to be involved in research next summer. And also many high schools also have research programs, and students are doing research through those programs, and those programs will help connect those students with science mentors at other institutions. So definitely you want research, definitely you want, some clinical exposure. Obviously you can't really be doing anything that's hands-on with medicine. And ideally you also want some community service to be a competitive BSMD applicant. And you also want to be taking the most rigorous course load that your school offers. And you want to be trying to get the highest GPA, the highest ACT, SAT possible. So certainly academic rigor for BSMD applicants is super important. And you want to be showing that you're taking advantage of the highest level courses, especially in math and science at your high school. For FlexMed, do they accept super score of SAT? This is a really tricky question. They're going to ask to see all of your scores. Ultimately, yes, they will look at a super score. When do most schools send out their secondaries this year? Some schools are sending out their secondaries already. We have a lot of students who have been receiving secondaries from a variety of medical schools from across the country. So they're starting, and I would expect that most schools will be sending out their secondaries by August. Is it looked down upon to send a committee letter from my do-it-yourself post-bac pre-med committee instead of my undergrad pre-med committee? No, if you've done a post-bac, and then you certainly can send that pre-med committee letter from your post-bac program, and that would make sense. Someone's asking about packages, annual advising packages to help during your freshman year in undergrad. Yes, we definitely start working with students as undergrads in freshman year, and we will meet with students periodically to kind of make sure that they're on track with each year, and to sort of come up with an overall game plan in terms of timing and all of that. And if you have more questions about services or how we can help you, feel free to reach out to us or sign up for a free 15-minute consultation. What is needed to be a competitive FlexMed applicant? We actually have all of the FlexMed admissions data on our website, and I will post that. Pooja, if you email us, info@mededits.com, and we will send you a link to that. But to be competitive for FlexMed, the students that we have that get interviewed for FlexMed, number one, and that's obviously the first step, and an incredibly impressive step, because the vast majority of students do not even receive interviews for FlexMed. They all have excellent academics. They also have amazing accomplishments, and they certainly have a clear vision of what they would do if they were accepted to the FlexMed program. Again, FlexMed is an accelerated program through Mount Sinai, where sophomores are admitted to the medical school, sophomores as undergrads. So they really have a demonstrated interest in something that they then will pursue as undergraduates that they otherwise wouldn't be able to pursue if they had to go through the traditional pre-med curriculum. Okay. Do med schools forgive low undergrad grades if I do well in a post-bac with prerequisites? Yes, certainly that can be forgiven. We have to look at the entire, the entire package here. Certainly we look at, we have worked with students, and it sounds like Shivani had below a 3.0 GPA and got into medical school. So certainly we have worked with students who did not do well as undergrads, and they turned it around. And I always explain to students who have not done well academically that it's always great to kind of have a line in the sand, like this was before I got serious and this was after I got serious. So certainly for a lot of students as undergraduates, or depending on the time in your life, you might not have the focus or the maturity, or just you might not be as driven at that point, and then you see the light and you suddenly get serious. So it's just because you've done badly doesn't mean you can't make up for that. It might take a little time. I mean, it might take 2 to 3 years, but it certainly can be done. Jennifer asks, should students place out of general biology and chemistry if they get a score of 4 or 5? Do medical schools look at the rigor of undergraduate courses they take or retake? Now, this is an interesting question, Jennifer. More medical schools are moving towards something called competency-based admissions, where you just need to demonstrate competency in a certain discipline, and they're actually not looking for specific prerequisites. Now, our recommendation until all medical schools move towards competency-based admissions is that you want to take those prerequisites even as an undergraduate. You don't want to place out of them, because so many medical schools do require those prerequisites, especially something like bio and chemistry. However, you know, depending on your college, if they allow students to place out of those courses, what we would recommend is actually talking to your pre-med advisor at your school, because when we've run into this with other students previously, you know, usually the colleges have experience with this, and so they will know the answer and they will say, oh yes, you know, this is kind of what we do and it's how we work around that. If you placed out of bio and you didn't take bio one, they'll probably have that specific answer for you. So anyway, this was a great office hours, and we thank you all so much for tuning in. Always feel free to email us, info@mededits.com, with any questions. We will be doing these office hours every couple of weeks. And, you know, please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't done so already, although if you all are here, you probably have subscribed. And, you know, if you have any other ideas for what we can offer you, or videos we can put up, or any ways that we could help, you know, all of you out there, both medical students, you know, pre-meds, people applying for residency, you know, whatever it may be, please reach out. Okay, thank you so much and have a great night.